friends, welcome to another episode of the Pyrate Round. I'm Captain Scotopus here, and this be the Scarlet Raven. And on this extra special episode of the Pyrate Round, we'll be talking about a very fine piratical person.
They're all extra special.
They sure are. And before we do that though, we're going to pour out a drink to us and to our friends. And this be to everyone who can't be here and those who are watching. We pour out some special Jamaican Mountain Red here from the Cursed Crystal Skull. Made by dwarves high in the mountains of Jamaica, they say.
It's pouring rain outside.
You think so? Could be raining out there. And we say to you friends, Yar Har. Thank you so much for joining us here at the Pyrate Round. And welcome to another episode. Welcome.
Yar Har.
Now, what are we going to do today there, Scarlet Raven?
Well, if I mention the name, the Gentleman Pyrate.
Well, when I think of the Gentleman Pirate, I think of our own Bartholomew Roberts there, who's quite the gentleman. You can see he's got a fine hat and a fine fuzzy demeanor there, and of course he's guarding the treasure chest. But you obviously are probably thinking of someone else.
I'm thinking of somebody else.
Who would you be thinking of?
I'm thinking of Stede Bonnet.
Stede Bonnet. Yeah,
the Gentleman Pirate.
The Gentleman Pirate.
Kind of a tragic tale in many ways.
A terrible tale. A tragedy. That's true.
So, Stede was born in 1688 in Bridgetown, Barbados.
True.
He was the child of Edward and Sarah Bonnet. He was an only child. Well, no, he actually had two sisters. My mistake there.
Oh, there you go.
He had two sisters. And Stede, both of his parents died when he was quite young.
Tragedy. It happened quite often.
Now, his parents were of the plantation class in Barbados.
The planters.
And it is said that his grandparents were actually some of the first people to colonize Barbados.
Probably so.
Or even his great-grandparents, one of the two. Oh. And so when Stede was young, as I mentioned, his parents died when he was still young, which bequeathed him all of the land, since he was the only male. Now, he was then raised, he and his sisters were raised by a John Gibbs. And sometime not long after, Jeanette Whetstone took control of the children. Now, whether it was because John Gibbs might have been money grubbing, trying to get the land and everything that the Stede was owed to him in his inheritance, we're not really quite sure. But Janet Whetstone made sure that Stede and his sisters had quite a good education.
Yeah,
so he was brought up quite well. Now, in Jamaica, when you own land, not Jamaica, Barbados.
Oh,
Barbados. My mistake there. In Barbados, when you own land, you were granted a rank. So if you had at least 50 acres of land, you were a captain. This is where Stede got his other moniker, Major.
Major Stede Bonnet.
Major Stede Bonnet. Now, Stede ended up marrying Mary Allenby on November 21st of 1709. She was the daughter of Captain William Allenby and Susanna Allenby. Now, when they got married, he was given more land. I believe it was another 100 acres. So he had quite the property. They had quite a plantation. They had 2 windmills which would grind the sugar cane, and he was quite prosperous. Now, somewhere along the lines, they had their firstborn son was Allenby, and Allenby died when he was in his infancy.
Oh, tragic.
And it is said that this really hit Stede pretty hard, losing his first son, Allenby. They eventually ended up having 3 more children, Edward, Mary, and Stede. And this is where Stede's story kind of gets interesting. Now, they say that he went pirating because of his wife. Now, Stede, having a lot of money, was having a ship built.
Yeah.
A Jamaican sloop.
Fine Jamaican sloop.
Of 10 guns, which is quite a bit of guns for that time. Fast, and he was having his books put in the captain's cabin. He had a captain's cabin built there in that ship. And that probably brought in a lot of more tensions with him and Mary.
True.
Spending this money on this needless ship. Why do you need this ship? And so they say, Charles Johnson was saying that Stede left because he had a nagging wife. Now, we've had some discussions on this ourselves, on how possible this probably is.
Well, weren't you saying that there's one account that has her dying?
There's one account, yes, there's some accounts that say that she died in 1709.
Right.
Now, this was before he went pirating, because he went pirating in 1717.
Right. So
Now, if she really died in 1709, you know, the loss of his son, Allenby, his firstborn son, and then the loss of his wife, you know, that could have caused a major mental breakdown.
that's true.
Which would have caused him to go do what he did.
True.
Now, before he left, he did leave paperwork that left, you know, his estates for his children. So he did, you know, plan for their well-being and care.
Yeah, that's true.
And you know, being that his parents died when he was young, and I believe his parents died when they were young, and so forth and so on. It just, you know, carried on in the family. Now Stede snuck away in May of 1717, went down to the harbor, got aboard his ship, which he had hired 70 men, and unlike most pirate ships where you are voted in command, Stede actually paid his crew, which is very unusual.
Well, he had the
Now,
money.
he also claimed to some people that he was going to go out pirate hunting. This is another discussion we have. You know, that possibly along the way, because he was not used to sailing, and they say that he got quite sick while he was sailing. And if that was true, maybe the crew took command and did what they wanted to do.
Yeah. And I think about this a lot, and I think, would a man in his position suddenly decide to go pirating?
In his mid to late 20s.
Yeah, it makes more sense that he...
No experience on the seas.
Right, it makes more sense to me that he had the ship built thinking he was going to go pirate hunting. In other words, protecting the shores of Barbados from pirates.
And for his trade.
Yeah, and for his trade, his sugar and rum trade. Now, and perhaps slave trade too. Now it seems that what's even a little bit more possible, is that he thought that he was going to use his sloop that he built, a magnificent sloop, as a warship, and to menace the pirates in the area and chase them down. And what happened perhaps later with his crew is that the crew decided, well, you know, we'll take advantage of this guy. He's not a seaman like us. He's a landlubber. He's wealthy. Now what's he going to do? We're going to, you know, the law will always treat him as a gentleman. Why don't we just go ahead and take the ship and turn pirate and start capturing some ships for ourselves?
Right.
They could have been a real outlaw crew.
Right. A lot of them were, you know, they were all experienced. You know, 70 people, crew who had probably once been pirates at one point or another.
Yar.
Now, they sailed north up along the Virginia coast in around 1717, and they captured 4 ships. They captured first the Anna, then the Young, then the Endeavor, and then the Turbot. Now, the Turbot, the captain actually knew who Stede was. Now, Stede was going by the name of Captain Edwards. He asked his crew to call him Captain Edwards, so that way it would kind of protect him.
Yeah.
And that may be part of the whole ruse again there, too. You know, he knowing that his crew had turned pirate on him, and he didn't want to be called, you know, Stede Bonnet or Major Bonnet, to throw people off.
True.
Call him Captain Edwards.
True. And now you got to ask yourself, if indeed he was going to go pirate hunting, why would he take those ships? There's an idea that perhaps he would be masquerading as a pirate in order to reduce competition. So perhaps he wanted to reduce competition from other traders by taking their ships, so that the Barbadian traders then would have all the business, and these other traders would not, if you take their ships out of the picture and frighten them.
Now, the Turbot, like I said, he burned it to the waterline.
Well, see, that's a terroristic act.
Right, that is a terroristic act.
You know, he's depriving a trader of his ship, and perhaps this was a business rival.
Could be. Now, they then sailed up towards New York, towards Gardner Island, where they were running low on supplies, and he sent men to Gardner Island to buy supplies. Now, that's not a very piratical thing to do, to be going. You would have just typically sent a crew in and taken what you wanted, but he actually sent people in to buy the supplies that they needed.
Right. It is, at this time, I'm still thinking that he must have thought he was operating within the largesse of the law somehow.
Right.
In his mind, and we, it's difficult to put ourselves in his mind, but he must have thought at this time, well, I'm still legitimate here. I am eliminating business rivals. I am operating as a pirate hunter. Maybe perhaps he thought himself as sort of a Barbadian freelance customs inspector. Who knows? But at this time, he must have thought, well, I'm getting away with this so far. Or perhaps the other hand, maybe his crew had already mutinied and already taken the ship. And he was just being held a hostage. Who knows?
Very true. Now, at that point, they headed back south. And along the coast of the Carolinas, they captured another brigantine who happened to be from Barbados, who recognized Stede Bonnet again.
There you go. There you go.
Which, would not bode good for him.
No. No, at this time, I've got to wonder now what he was thinking. In his next act, we're going to see was one of those situations where it seems so irrational, you have to wonder if the crew had already mutinied on him and already held him prisoner in his book-filled cabin,
Right.
and whether or not he was truly in command of that ship.
So as after the brig, they sailed south along the Carolinas, and they weren't doing very well at this time. They were starting to run low on supplies, and they came across a ship on the horizon, and they made the choice to pursue it. Well, as they drew closer, there was a lot of commotion amongst the crew not to attack the ship because it was a Spanish ship. And the crew knew that it was probably a warship. And Stede overruled them, told them they had to attack the Spanish ship. And reluctantly, as they were arguing, they were pulling up and the ship ran out its guns and opened fire before Stede and the crew of the Revenge could open fire back. And this caused great devastation across the decks. There were, bloody bodies and mutilated bodies, and Stede was, from the shaking of it, was thrown to the deck. And, having never seen this, it threw him into shock, and he didn't know what to do.
True.
And as he laid there, the Spanish ship swung across the stern of the Revenge and opened up fire. And once again, it rocked the ship. Now, typically, when you hit a ship from the stern side, it's a bad thing because it's the weakest point of the ship.
True.
And you just send cannonballs flying, and if it hits the powder magazine, because usually the powder magazine is not too far away, the ship will blow up. So it's a very bad thing to be hitting the stern.
True.
And it threw glass and splinters and shattered his cabin and his books, and he could hear all this. And splinters hit him, and he tried to stand up, but he was so weak and shaken, and there was a loss of blood, and he fainted and collapsed.
True.
And when he woke up, he was in his cabin, bandaged up, still shaken, couldn't stand up because he was too weak, and he basically couldn't control the ship. Now, he lost quite a bit of his men. Almost half of his crew were either dead or wounded.
True.
Out of 70 crew, that's quite a bit.
That is a lot.
It's a lot.
Yeah.
You figure now you're down to half, 35 or so.
Half strength.
Half strength.
Yeah.
And the crew made the decision to sail towards Nassau, which was a pirate haven.
True.
And upon sailing into Nassau, his crew all got in the boats and sailed into the port, and Stede was left all alone on his ship.
Now you have to wonder why he had named his ship the Revenge. Who was he taking revenge against? Who was he seeking revenge against? Ships were named for certain things, and there was a great significance to a ship's name. And if he had called his ship the Revenge, well, who in the world would he be trying to seek revenge against? And it raises the question that perhaps he had business rivals he wanted to avenge against, or someone had wronged him, or perhaps society in general. He was a Jacobite.
He was a Jacobite.
A supporter of James III.
Right, which a lot of pirates
And
were.
they were. They were supporters of the Stuart line. and you know, Bonnie Prince Charlie and all the things there. Later on, Bonnie Prince Charlie, but then it would be James III, and you know, they did not consider the king, the German king they called him, in England, yeah, to be their actual king. And perhaps a revenge idea had something to do with that he was taking revenge against the royal authority for something, or some imagined slight that he took.
Or maybe he was a merchant.
Or maybe so, something like that.
So upon reaching Nassau, his crew abandoned him.
True.
And Edward Thatch was there. Now Thatch had recently been sailing with Benjamin Hornigold.
Yeah, that's right.
And had decided to split off at this time. Well, he rowed out to the Revenge, and Stede, trying to figure out what he was going to do, looks up and there's Blackbeard.
Yeah. Stede was still quite injured at this time. Not having proper medical attention, anything of the sort, in very dire straits, wounded aboard his very damaged craft. And then Edward Thatch comes aboard to talk with him.
Now, imagine, you know, you're Stede Bonnet, and you hear this reputation of Blackbeard. This large, imposing man with his black beard and ribbons and dark, swarthy skin, and
true,
you know, quite the reputation of a pirate.
There's also a belief that the two of them knew each other.
Right.
That Ed Thatch was actually of the planter class in Jamaica, and Stede Bonnet being of the planter class in Barbados, that they might have known each other, if not intimately, they might have known each other then just causally.
And by name.
By name or through their families.
Now, Blackbeard struck up a deal with Stede and told him that he would repair the ship. He mounted 2 more guns, and that he would command the ship until Stede was well enough again to take command. Now, Stede was you know, quite interested in this. You know, it's a great way for him to stay out pirating. You know, his ship would get repaired. It would get more guns.
True.
He would still have his great cabin. He would have Blackbeard as, you know, as a partner. Mm-hmm. You know, what better way to go?
Yeah, exactly.
It'd be like any, you know, major corporation person, you know, who's small town and
mm-hmm.
and having the opportunity to hook up with, say, a Bill Gates.
True. Something like that.
You know, and somebody who, you know, helped them out.
Yeah.
But so the two got this partnership, and Teach brought aboard all of his crew, and he had his own ship, and he gave his ship to Richards, one of his lieutenants, and they went out pirating, and they captured many ships. Now, somewhere along the lines, after capturing many ships, they went on up. They went to Martinique, and they came across the La Concorde.
The La Concorde, the French slave ship.
Right, which then we know that they captured, and Blackbeard would take and rename the Queen Anne's Revenge.
True.
It would become his flagship.
Yeah, yeah.
At this point, along the line, Stede was starting to feel better, and they gave him command of a ship, and he split off from Blackbeard, and he went sailing as Blackbeard was trying to do repairs on the Queen Anne's Revenge and modify her, make her better,
mm-hmm.
bring her up to the mini-gunned ship that she became.
True.
And Stede sailed on over to the Bay of Honduras, near Roatan. And it's there he came across the 400-ton ship, the Protestant Caesar.
True.
And his crew probably was thinking deja vu at this point.
Mm-hmm.
Because
not again.
Not again.
Yeah.
And Stede decided to wait until nightfall. And as night was falling, he came across, he brought the Revenge up along the stern of the Protestant Caesar and opened fire. He didn't do a whole lot of damage. And the Protestant Caesar started returning fire. Well, as he pulled up alongside,
Right there.
Right.
There would be Stede fighting the Protestant Caesar right there.
Right. As he pulled up along the ship, he started yelling at him, saying, you know, you better not fire upon me again, or I will give no quarter to you, and it'll be bad for you. Well, the captain of the Protestant Caesar was not impressed.
No.
And small arms fire and more gunfire, and they alongside running fight for 5 hours. And you know, poor Stede just couldn't win the fight. And after 5 hours, he called off the fight, and the Protestant Caesar went off on its way, and he went running with his tail between his legs to go find Blackbeard.
True.
Now, upon finding Blackbeard, he told Blackbeard about the fight with the Protestant Caesar, and it was a council was called, and it was pretty much decided that Stede had done a pretty stupid thing.
Mm-hmm.
Overstepped his boundaries.
Yeah.
Now, Blackbeard didn't want any ship to have gotten the better of any pirate. So he took the Revenge away from Stede again, put it back in Richard's command, and put it in Richard's command at this time, and they went off hunting. And they come across some other ships, and it wasn't long upon this time that they did the blockade of Charlestown.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
They went up looking for the Protestant Caesar, but went up north and blockaded Charlestown and took a lot of. They didn't get much treasure, but they got medicines and things.
That's what they really wanted, was the medicine chest, and
Right.
it's probably because his men had become so poxed from laying with the prostitutes there in Nassau that they were sorely afflicted by the scurvy and the pox, and maybe not the scurvy, but certainly the pox, and what they needed was the medicine chest full of mercury so that his men could get cured, so they could get back to being a regular crew.
And after leaving Charlestown, they did come across the Protestant Caesar. And now, being that they were now faced with the Queen Anne's Revenge,
A large ship.
Ware, who was the captain of the Protestant Caesar, and his crew got in all their boats and sailed to the shore and hid in the jungle. While Blackbeard and his crew just went and picked the ship clean.
Yeah, true.
And he sent a message out to Ware, and he invited him, and he said, you'll be protected. You come on board the Queen Anne's Revenge, we won't harm you. And Ware was quite afraid, and he did. And there, he met Blackbeard and Stede, and Blackbeard told Ware that we're sorry, but because of what you did, we're going to have to burn your ship to the waterline. But we're not going to kill your crew. Now Blackbeard had this reputation, but he actually never killed anybody until the very last fight.
Yeah.
Stede, on the other hand, was said to have killed quite a few people and many of his crew. There was even a rumor that he was one of the first few people to make somebody walk the plank, but that's actually not quite true.
I like that idea, though, that perhaps in his overzealous idea to fit in with a band of ruffians and rascals, that he would have done something like that, just to seem to be tougher than normal.
He did get this reputation of being quite cruel to his own crew for the slightest things that they did or didn't do. If they were insubordinate or didn't do what he exactly wanted them to, he would whip them right there in front of his crew. Which is a way to lose your crew.
It's, well, yes and no. I mean, he was from the class that dealt out punishment constantly to those who were beneath him. And he considered himself to be better. He was one of the better class. He was the betters of these peasant sort of thing that he'd hired for his crew. And what way to keep them in line, of course, whether they're on the plantation or whether they're on a boat, is you lash them. You punish them, corporal punishment.
Now, Stede was basically, in all intents and purposes, a captive on the Queen Anne's Revenge at this time.
Yeah.
And as Blackbeard and the crew were sailing along, the Queen Anne's Revenge struck the sandbar and jostled the ship, and they could hear the back of it breaking, the stern of it breaking, and they tried to have the Revenge and the Adventure at this time try and pull the Queen Anne's Revenge off the bar, but they couldn't do it. It was too late. So Blackbeard decided, well, what we're going to do is we're going to go honest. We're going to take everything off the Queen Anne's Revenge. We're going to put it on the Adventure and the Revenge. And Stede, I want you to sail to Bath, take a boat to Bath, and I want you to take the a pardon. And Stede had heard at this time that a pardon was okay, but it was only up to a certain date. And they had his attack on the Protestant Caesar and them attacking the Protestant Caesar and burning it fell after the guidelines.
True.
So technically they couldn't have taken a pardon, but Stede agreed, and he took a bunch of molasses and sugar that Blackbeard had given him to as a kind of a bribery for Charles Eden in Bath.
Yeah, the
Governor Charles Eden.
Yeah.
And up there in Bath, he was given a letter of pardon. And he went, Blackbeard was supposed to meet him, and he went looking back for Blackbeard and went back down to where it was, and Blackbeard was gone. But the revenge was still there, stripped clean, nothing left. So he lost all the treasure that he had gotten and everything, and he was quite mad. He was quite upset that he wanted revenge now upon Blackbeard, and he figured he could now take Blackbeard because he had 12 guns and the adventurer only had 8.
Ah, there you go.
So he sailed around and around and around, and he was going to take. He had an offer to go to St. Thomas. Blackbeard had told him, hey, let's get our pardon. We'll go to St. Martin, to the Dutch Isles, St. Thomas.
I think they're Danish, weren't they?
Yes, they were Danish, and we'll get a letter of marque to go fight the Spanish because the Dutch were fighting the Spanish at the time. The Danish. I kept saying Dutch, the Danish, and Stede was going to do that, but he decided along the way they needed supplies, so he started coming up along ships and attacking them and trading. Forcefully trading items that they supposedly needed.
Yeah.
And once again, people found out who he was and knew who he was, and he sailed around and about, and they captured another ship. He ended up having 4 ships at this time, and they sailed up the Cape Fear, where they decided that they were going to careen and repair the Revenge.
And the Cape Fear River now, this would be in North Carolina today.
Now, at this point in time, he had changed the name of the Revenge to the Royal James.
There you go.
Which,
unlucky. Good Jacobite name.
Good Jacobite name. Unlucky, too, in renaming your ship.
It is unlucky to rename a ship, that's true.
And Governor Johnson in the Carolinas, there was all these pirates that were running around. There was Chris Moody and there was Charles Vane, and so he decided to send out a force to go find these pirates. And he had 2 ships, the Henry and the Sea Nymph. And Colonel Rhett was put in charge of this force, and they were going to go out and find Moody, and they were going to find Vane. And Vane and Moody had both heard that this force was coming, and they sailed away. Well, poor Stede, he's stuck here in the Cape Fear, and he's trying to careen his ship, and along comes the Henry and the Sea Nymph, and they get stuck. So he can hear them all night long, and the tides were low, so Cape Fear was low. He couldn't sail, and they waited all night. And in the early morning, here comes the Henry, refloating. So he decides he's going to go after him. He's going to try and make his escape with this one ship, formerly the Revenge, now the Royal James. And as they are sailing, Stede and his ship are sailing close to the banks, and they hit a bar because the tides were starting to go out. Now,
unlucky.
His ship was like this, so his deck was like this. His guns would have been firing up into the sky. Now, the Henry was sailing along the other way, and because of the tides, it hit a sandbar, but it was the other way. So his guns would have been shooting into the water. So the two couldn't have used their cannons. The small arms fire erupted in the Cape Fear, and a lot of taunting was going on between the crews of the Royal James and the Henry. One that their pretender king George, and then Bonnie Prince Charlie, back and forth. Or James, not Bonnie Prince Charlie, but James, and they're bantering back and forth, and it was a real hope of who was going to right their ship first when the tides came in. And during the fight, the Henry had 12 casualties, and the Royal James, formerly the Revenge, took 7 killed and 5 wounded. 2 would later die. And as the tides came in, the Henry was righted first, before the Royal James, and they sailed up along, and as they were fighting, Stede pointed his gun at one of his crew, telling them to fight, and they wouldn't fight. And about that time, one of his crew hit dead and dropped right next to him, and he was quite in shock. And as the Henry pulled up next to him, he pulled out 2 guns, and he threatened to kill his crew and to kill anybody else, but his crew was tired of fighting, and they gave up.
They surrendered.
And Stede was captured at this point in time by Colonel Rhett and taken to Charlestown. where his crew was put into jail, into guard, but he was actually put into a plantation.
Yeah, because he's being a gentleman, of course. It would be very unseemly for him to end up in jail. So he would be a special guest of an area of a plantation, where, of course, that plantation being surrounded by hostile wilderness, there was really no way for him to escape anywhere, as long as he was held there as a special guest of this place.
Now, as Stede was held in the plantation, he was held at Nathaniel Partridge's plantation. And he had quite a few supporters, people that really liked Stede. You know, he was about 29, 30 years of age, and pretty well liked. And
he was a man of a certain class. He was a Jacobite, as many of the people were there, and probably wealthy, probably still a landowner, and you know, educated. And those people who lived in those areas at the time, the planter class and the plantation owners, will look upon him, you know, no matter what his misdeeds, will look upon him as one of their own.
Now, Stede had this belief that either Charles Vane was going to come to his rescue, because he had heard that Charles Vane was back in the area again and would rescue him, or Christopher Moody. And he had high hopes that one of those guys would come along. Well, time went and nothing happened, and Stede and a friend of his, David Harriet, who had been taken by Blackbeard, who really liked Stede, who was being held captive in the Partridge house, decided to make their escape. Now, they say that Stede was wearing Mrs. Partridge's shawl, but they also say dressed as a woman, and made his escape. Now, as he made his escape, there was a boat waiting for him, so he probably had help from some of the friends there in Charlestown.
Probably so.
And they made their escape, and they went to this island. Now, once again, they were hoping that either Charles Vane or Moody would come along, and he could see the Royal James sitting there in the harbor, and he couldn't take his ship. And he and Harriet sailed to an island. And as they waited for somebody to come and rescue them, they had a fire going and smoke, and there was rumors of pirates, and of course Rhett went back out after him. And as Stede was scanning the horizon for a friend to come and rescue him, Rhett came in with his force and shot Harriet dead, and Stede was captured once again and taken back to Charlestown.
Yeah, there he was.
Now, at this time, he was not treated as nicely. They put him in under guard this time, because they didn't want to risk a chance of him being escaped.
True.
There were quite a few people that still protested, wanted him to be freed and treated right, but they wouldn't let him. And his crew was judged, and it was deemed that they would all be hung, and that they were. Well, just about that time, just before that, Chris Moody's crew was in the area, as Stede had been hoping, and Christopher Moody's crew was captured, and Chris Moody was killed, and they were brought in and put in, and put on trial and hung after Stede's crew was all hung. So there, poor Stede waited, and he wrote this mournful letter, which the captain here has a copy of, and he will try and read it.
Yeah, it did be printed on a very old paper in an old style, but I'll try to get my way through it here. So, let's see. We got money falling everywhere for the rats there. A coin for your rat, people. A coin for your rat. There you go.
By the rum.
Honoured Sir, I have presumed on the confidence of your eminent goodness to throw myself after this manner at your feet, to implore you'll be graciously pleased to look upon me with tender bowels of pity and compassion, and believe me to be the most miserable man this day breathing, that the tears proceeding from my most sorrowful soul may soften your heart, and incline you to consider my dismal state. Wholly I must confess, unprepared to receive so soon the dreadful execution you have been pleased to appoint me, and therefore beseech you to think me an object of your mercy. For God's sakes, good sir, let the oaths of 3 Christian men weigh something with you, who are ready to depose, when you please to allow them me liberty. The compulsion I lay upon in committing those acts to which I am doomed to die. I entreat you not to let me fall a sacrifice to the envy and ungodly rage of some few men, who, not being yet satisfied with blood, feign to believe that I had the happiness of a longer life in this world. I shall still employ it in a wicked manner, which, to remove that and other doubts from your honour, I heartily beseech you'll permit me to live, and I'll voluntarily put it ever out of my power by separating all of my limbs from my body, only reserving the use of my tongue, to call continually on and pray to the Lord my God, and mourn all of my days in sackcloth and ashes, to work out confident hopes of my salvation. At that great and dreaded day, when all righteous souls shall receive their just rewards, and to render your honour a further assurance of my being, incapable to prejudice any of my fellow Christians, if I was so wicked bent, I humbly beg you will, as a punishment for my sins, for my poor soul's sake, indent me as a menial servant to your honour and this government during my life, and send me up to the farthest inland garrison or settlement in the country, or in other ways you'll be pleased to dispose of me, and likewise that you'll receive the willingness of my friends to be bound for my good behaviour and constant attendance to your commands. Now,
Another
not
page
yet.
there.
No, not yet.
Oh,
I once more beg for the Lord's sake, dear sir, that as you are a Christian, you will be as charitable as to have mercy and compassion on my miserable, I suppose miserable soul perhaps, or being. On my miserable soul, but too newly awakened from an old habit of sin to entertain so confident hopes and assurances of being received into the arms of blessed Jesus as is necessary to reconcile me to so speedy of death. Wherefore, as my life, blood, reputation of my family, and future happy state lies entirely at your disposal, I implore you to consider me with a Christian and a charitable heart, and determine mercifully of me that I may ever acknowledge and esteem you next to God, my Saviour, and oblige me ever to pray that our Heavenly Father will also forgive your trespasses. Now, the God of peace, that brought again from the dead our Lord Jesus, that great shepherd of the sheep through the blood of the everlasting covenant, make you perfect in every good work to do his will, working in that which is well-pleasing in his sight through Jesus Christ, to whom be glory forever and ever is the hearty prayer of your honours. Most miserable and afflicted servant then, Stede Bonnet. So it was quite an elaborate letter he wrote, trying to appeal to the mercy of the court, to that of the judge, and offering to become an indentured servant to that of the court, or to the judge, or to be a ward of the court or the state, so forth, to be sent to a plantation far away, or an old encampment someplace where he'd be out of harm's way and out of the temptation for what he was. And he's appealing to the court as a Christian man would to another Christian man, and saying, please don't believe what people have told you about me, but take it upon me that I wish to make amends, and I wish to appeal to your mercy of the court.
let's take a moment and raise a pint to Stede and take a moment.
To Stede Bonnet.
And therefore you have become a true penitent, and therefore, having now discharged my duty to you as a Christian by giving you the best counsel I can with respect to the salvation of your soul, I must now do my office as a judge. The sentence that the law hath appointed to pass upon you for offences which this court therefore awarded is, that you, the said Stede Bonnet, shall go henceforth to the place from whence you came, and from hence to the place of execution, where you shall be hanged by the neck till you are dead. And the God of infinite mercy be merciful to your soul.
Now, what happened then, Scarlet Raven?
Well, Stede was then brought up to the court of Judge Nicholas Tott. And they ended up finding him guilty, even though he had somebody who was on his side who said that, you know, yeah, he was kind of pushed into a lot of this, and he was a good man. Nicholas Tott decided, you know, we needed to make an example of
make an
Stede.
example of him, yeah.
And as you probably heard a moment ago, when we took a moment, we had the little bit that was the notes that from Nicholas Tott, who read the judgment for Stede. Now, Stede was then on his day of judgment, December 10th, I believe it was, 1718. I think that's what I had here. Let me look at my notes. I had my notes up and I kind of blew it there. December 10th, 1718, yes. So anyway, so Stede was put into a cart. And there he was taken out to White Point in Charlestown. And he could see the hings was loose. And he could see the graves from his crew that had already been dug and washed over, because it's, you know, this part of the land was where the titles came in.
At low tide.
Low tide. It was quite the. It was what they do is they'd hung pirates at low tide.
Yeah. So that the place where they hanged then was neither the land nor the sea. It was in between the two, in the tidal zone between low and high tide.
And as Stede was taken out by cart to White Point, he was handed a bunch of posies, all tied up. And the noose was put around him, and he couldn't scarce say a word. So, which makes you wonder if somebody didn't give him a lot, either to drink or some kind of medication to kind of, you know, kind of take away the pain. Because
to calm his nerves, perhaps, and to let him endure this. And so many people, you know, would give him strong drink or some narcotic herbs or something of the sort, so that they, you know, wouldn't experience the trauma and the shock of their imminent death.
Right. And at which point he was pushed from the cart. And as he lay, as he twitched, supporters ran up, grabbed him by the legs, and pulled on him.
Yeah, to strangle him.
To strangle him.
Yeah,
to make his death
a faster death.
much quicker.
Yeah.
And there he hung for a few days, rotten and decomposing, before he was finally buried.
Terrible.
Very terrible. Now, there are relatives of Stede Bonnet that are still alive today. Now, there was the thing we started off with, that Mary had maybe had died and drove him to him, but then other things that I dug up that she died in 1750, which would have made her, you know, in her 60s at the time of her death.
True.
And then, of course, the children carrying on and living their lives, and who knows what would have happened to the estate there in Barbados if the Bonnet relatives still own it, or what had happened.
Oh, it's an interesting thing to think about, if indeed his line does carry on, since he did have children.
Now, we're going to take a quick moment here to say the names of those that were hung, that were Stede Bonnet's crew.
These were his crew members, folks, on board his ship.
Robert Tucker of Jamaica. Edward Robinson of Newcastle upon Tyne. Neil Patterson of Aberdeen. William Scott of Aberdeen. William Eddy, alias Neddy, of Aberdeen. Alexander Ennard of Jamaica. George Rose of Glasgow. John Ridge of London. Matthew King of Jamaica. Henry Virgin of Bristol. James Robin, alias Rattle, of London. James Mullet, alias Millet, of London. Thomas Price of Bristol. James Wilson of Dublin. John Lopez of Oporto, Portugal. Zachariah Long of Holland. John Bailey, London. John William Smith of Charlestown. Thomas Carneen of Maidstone in Kent. John Thomas of Jamaica. William Morrison of Jamaica. Samuel Booth of Charlestown. William Hewitt of Jamaica, John Levitt of North Carolina, William Levers of Eves, John Bailey, alias Timberhead of Bathtown, North Carolina, Robert Boyd of Bathtown, North Carolina.
People from all over the world, it seems.
Right.
All over the Atlantic Basin.
And of his crew, there were 4 that were not hung.
Oh.
Now, this is a book that I recently read about Stede Bonnet. There was one name I did not have in there, Daniel Perry of Guernsey. But this is a recent book I read, Stede Bonnet, Charlestown Gentleman Pyrate, by Christopher Boyd Downey. This is a pretty easy read, but you know, there's a lot of information here. And it's good information about Stede. It's probably more information than you would find in this book, A General History of Robberies and Murders of the Most Notorious Pirates by Captain Charles Johnson. We know that this was pretty salacious and rumor-mongering and not quite very true.
Well,
but it has good information. It's a good book to have.
It's got it would have primary sources, but the primary sources would actually be colored by the morality of the time, where you could not have pirates be portrayed as being honorable at all. So even though you would have information regarding their birth or their exploits or their deeds, they all had to come to an evil end, because of course good always triumphs over evil.
Right. Now there's a third book that I'm currently reading right now called The Pirate's Revenge by L.N. Crook. Now this is about a young boy on Stede's crew by the name of Aaron. And a lot of the information is the same information you find in these books, so it's pretty right on. Now the person that wrote this book claims to be a relative of young Aaron, who actually supposedly served on the Revenge, and had notes from somebody they knew that was related to Stede Bonnet. It's not a bad book. It's pretty quick and easy to read. The only part that I don't like is it's pretty religious in some parts. So you have to take all that, if you're not religious, as a very grain of thought.
People were quite
but
religious.
People in that time were very religious.
So there's one other book that's got quite a bit in it about Stede and his relationship with Blackbeard. And that's this one right here, Blackbeard, Birth of America, by Samuel Marquis.
We've actually talked about this book in a previous episode. And
there's a great deal of information here about Blackbeard, but also with regards to Stede Bonnet and his relationship with Blackbeard. It comes out, his story is shown in here. Now, this is a historical novel. It's not a total fact, but it's suppositions based upon new historical findings. So you'll come across with a rather interesting idea then about Stede and his relationship with Blackbeard, and his further exploits in this book.
Right, and this one also, has a lot of Blackbeard, and it's historical fiction. And I would recommend reading both of these books if you're interested in reading about Stede Bonnet, along with the Stede Bonnet Charleston's Gentleman Pyrate. Not that he was from Charleston; he was from Barbados, but he served around that area, and a lot of information about Bonnet and the judgment and the crew and the history of what transpired with Port Stede, the Gentleman Pirate.
Yep. So, folks, there you have it now.
It's a longer episode.
Quite a long episode there about Stede Bonnet, the Gentleman Pirate. But we wanted to present this information to you, and you can do the research yourself and come to your own conclusions. And that's what we're about here on the Pirate Round, is we like to present information and allow you to do your own research and have your own conclusions. But we want to present pirate history to you, pirate legend and lore and stories, and about specific pirates or events or things such as that. And here we have one now about Stede Bonnet, the Gentleman Pirate from Barbados, and his rather tragic story and his relationships with other pirates, most notably Blackbeard. But we pour out our toast here, and this toast, of course, is for you, our friends, and we thank you so much for watching this episode. And we say to you, friends, always be strong, always be true, and always be true to yourself at that being a pirate. And we say to you then now, your heart.
Your heart. And in these troubled times, keep you nug and smart. Smooth sailing to you.
Smooth sailing, folks.